Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I am Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to continue right along with our look at the Korean War. And before we begin our lecture proper, I would just like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lectures. So in our last lectures we looked at the rise of Richard Nixon. Nixon, who came to Congress in 1946 as a freshman, sort of springboarded his career as a hardliner, as a Cold War hardliner, and as a vehement anti-communist. And he rode his position on the House Un-American Committee to one a repeat election, to be re-elected in 1948 to the House. And then also in 1958, he springboarded and left out of the House and into the Senate with a very successful 1950 Senate campaign. And he had, and in 6 years, as a hardliner, has a staunch anti-communist, sort of springboarded him to being tapped in 1952 as the running mate of Dwight D. Eisenhower. And within the White House, Nixon sort of gained the reputation of the enforcer. He was the guy who sort of saw that the decisions were made and that orders were carried out. He also enhanced his reputation as a Cold War hardliner anti-communist during his tenure as vice president. He would spend 8 years as vice president. We also looked at the escalation of the Korean War. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel, which delineated Soviet and American spheres of influence, and the expectation was that Korea will be reunited. Korea had been invaded around the outbreak of World War I by Japan, and had been held as an imperial conquest by the Japanese. The expectation was that at some point the peninsula will be reunited. That elections would be held, and that the Americans and the Soviets would simply back off and allow the Koreans to govern themselves. The elections never took place. The Americans and the Soviets both put in place antagonistic and ideologically opposed regimes. The Americans put in a democratic regime under Sigmund Rhee, and the Soviets put in a communist government under Kim Il-sung, and it will be Kim Il-sung who, in June of 1950, June of 1950, he invaded the South, and that sparked the war. That really sort of escalated everything. And American policymakers, they took this at this moment to put the communist containment policy into place. They also were very much influenced by the appeasement policies of the French and British leaders, how they appeased the Nazis in the 1930s, or sought to appease Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in the 1930s. And they were determined not to make the same mistake again. They would not allow communism to spread and to gain traction and to become stronger. They would deal with communism and deal with it swiftly and effectively while the threat was still weak. And it is at that point that we begin our lecture for today. And we begin with looking at Douglas MacArthur. Now, MacArthur, General MacArthur, was the commander of the American forces in Korea. He'd also been overseeing the organization or the reorganization of the Japanese government on democratic footing. MacArthur took charge of the forces that were sent to Korea, and MacArthur had been in Japan overseeing the miraculous recovery of the Japanese economy. The invasion of Korea, which MacArthur organized, was nothing short of tactical brilliance. Landing at Incheon, he forced the communist forces into a straight panic and retreat. They had been fighting at Busan, south of MacArthur's landing, and were in real danger of having their supply routes cut off and being entrapped in the southern portion of the peninsula. With the retreat of the North Koreans, MacArthur decided to go on the offensive and invade North Korea. MacArthur's success was so great that Mao, the Chinese communist leader, grew worried, and he grew fearful that MacArthur, flushed with victory in Korea, would invade China to overthrow his government. Now, to assuage his fears, Mao joined the war and sent Chinese troops into North Korea to forestall an American victory. And the sheer number of Chinese troops sent into Korea made the American forces go into a retreat themselves. The Chinese entry into the war made the fighting very mercurial. Between the end of 1950 and early 1951, both sides caught themselves, and they found themselves really deadlocked right back at the original dividing line of the 38th parallel. With China's entry into the war, MacArthur began to call for direct attacks on China. MacArthur had played a prominent role in the victory against Japan, and he wanted to employ the same tactics against China and Korea, attack Chinese industrial centers, disrupt their logistical capabilities, and use the nationalist government to weaken the communist regime in China. Now, MacArthur's plan really entailed the complete rollback of China, rollback of communism within Korea and within China. Now, Omar Bradley, who was by then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and President Harry Truman, they disagreed with MacArthur's battle plan. They feared escalating the conflict into a great war. They themselves were anti-communist, but they feared creating the Korean conflict into a great war against communism instead of a minor conflict against communism. They did not want to antagonize the Soviet Union, who they feared would enter the war on China's behalf if the United States made direct attacks upon China. Their line of thinking was that a nuclear war would potentially erupt over Korea, and that was simply not a chance they were willing to take. Omar Bradley and President Truman preferred to focus on Western Europe. Now, MacArthur was floored and angered by this response. He expected his input to be taken at face value. He came in with the understanding that Truman would be like Roosevelt, that he would let the generals do what they wanted to do. And largely, he felt that way because by the time Truman became president, the war was largely over. Many had the idea that it wasn't so much Truman's idea to drop the bomb, but simply Truman's the military advisors on hand and the scientists they compelled Truman to drop the bomb. And owing to his reputation, owing to his career as a military leader, to his long military service, to the renown that he had for coming back to the Philippines and leading the campaign against Japan, and now his leading the campaign against the Koreans, MacArthur thought that Truman would simply defer to him, and that was far from the case. In response to all of that, MacArthur sent a letter to a Republican congressman who read the letter on the House floor, on the floor of the House of Representatives. This act came to be seen as a direct challenge to Harry Truman's authority. Truman flexed his executive muscles in response, and he dismissed General MacArthur from his command. And as we have seen, there has always been a strong tradition within the United States of subordination of the military, of military officers to political leaders, with only really two noticeable exceptions. And those exceptions were, one, Andrew Jackson and his decision to invade Spanish Florida, And his invasion of Spanish Florida was again rebuked by the sitting president and his Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams was the sitting Secretary of State, and James Monroe was the sitting president. Andrew Jackson thought they would be pleased. Neither of them were amused, and they immediately made reconciliation. They immediately attempted to reconcile with Spain over Jackson's invasion of Spanish Florida and his threats to hang the governor. And the other was, of course, George B. McClellan. McClellan differed politically. He had a different political ideology and a different social ideology than Abraham Lincoln. And he made no secret of his disdain of Lincoln. Just as Truman dismissed MacArthur, Lincoln dismissed McClellan at every opportunity, and even faced McClellan in a political election, the election of 1864, which Lincoln won handedly. But in Truman's opinion, MacArthur had gone too far, challenging him in public. MacArthur was replaced by General Matthew Ridgway on the ground, and in dismissing MacArthur, which was an audacious move for Truman, he sort of went up against a national hero. MacArthur was a national hero. Had I stated earlier, he was widely admired for his martial success and his reorganization of Japan. He was invited to speak before Congress upon his return home. And you have to remember that General MacArthur, between his retreat from the Philippines, the campaign to reconquer the Philippines, and the campaign to defeat Japan, and his role as the military commander of American forces in Japan, and his invasion of the Korean Peninsula, between 1951 and 1941, he had spent all that time overseas, nearly a decade, a very long time overseas for General MacArthur. So upon his return home, he was invited. He had the opportunity to speak before Congress, and he sure did take that opportunity. He went there and he spoke really well, and there was a lot of talks that maybe MacArthur might be the Republican nominee to serve as president. And it also really speaks volumes about his reputation, because he had been out of the country really before 1941. He was stationed there during the Japanese takeover, but he had been out of the country since the mid to late 1930s. And for someone who had not been on the ground, not really been around these politicians, the American populace, he still retained this great aura around him. Now, negotiations for a truce began in 1951, but the war on the ground continued. Syngman Rhee, the South Korean leader, advocated for the complete reunification of Korea under himself, just as Kim Il-sung advocated for the complete reunification of Korea under himself. It would take the advocacy for one of both of these men were reasons why the peace talks floundered and failed, and while it took 2 years for the negotiations to become finalized. Truman retired in 1952, and Eisenhower won the election in 1952, being inaugurated in 1953. Now, the truce, or the armistice, has stood for 65 years. It's still in place now. There never was a peace treaty to end the Korean War. There was simply an armistice. Both sides simply agreed to stop fight. Well, the both sides agreed to stop fighting each other, and that's the situation that stood in 1953, and that's the situation where it stands now. Now, the Korean War itself, claimed the lives of some 30,000 Americans and over 2 million Koreans. The Korean Peninsula was devastated. The border, the demilitarized zone, remains also up to the present. It's a very bitter, a very hard, and really unstomachable legacy, the Korean War, for the Korean people themselves, for the peninsula. Now, the quick return to the fight, to war, to fight communism, and the lack of outright victory created a perfect storm at home, in which Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin began profiting politically by making reckless accusations of disloyalty. The anti-communist surge was in full swing, but before McCarthy came into power. He joined the movement because it was politically beneficial. That was the sole reason. He was not very attached to the hard line on communism ideology. He did so to gain national prominence. What McCarthy did was to mount a national witch hunt that infringed upon the civil liberties of all Americans. McCarthy had been a Wisconsin judge, and he was a war veteran. He served in the war. He was elected to the Senate in 1946, and during his re-election campaign, he attached himself to the anti-communist movement. This is back in 1952 when he's running for re-election. He did that. He had deceived the voters in Wisconsin by claiming to be a highly decorated combat aviator. He was a veteran, but he was a non-combat veteran. He earned the nickname Tail Gunner Joe, and it was used derisively against him when it came out that he had no combat experience. McCarthy's accusations knew no bounds. He openly accused President Truman of knowingly prosecuting and keeping known protecting, I should say, and keeping known communists in the State Department. This is again hinting at the Alger Hiss trial. His accusations cast the Democratic Party as disloyal to the United States. And you can really sort of see where McCarthy is coming from. He was, throughout the late 19th century, after the Civil War, the Republican Party engaged, and we discussed this on our lectures on the Civil War and the period of Reconstruction of the Reconstruction of the former slave states. The Democratic Party, to their great humiliation, had been the party of secession. The South was solidly Democrat from the time of Andrew Jackson up until Reconstruction, when large numbers of African Americans were given the vote. And flipped those states to Republican states. From the end of Reconstruction up until the midpoint of the Civil Rights Movement, the South was still again solidly Democrat. And the Republican Party had painted them as the party of treason. They embarked on what we call waving the bloody shirt, in which they pointed out the fact that it had been those guys who had started the Civil War, who had caused the national calamity. And now Alger Hiss is waving the communist shirt, if you want to think of it that way, by saying, look, these guys are protecting communists. Alger Hiss was a close friend and confidant of Dean Acheson. Dean Acheson is Harry Truman's sitting Secretary of State. Where there's smoke, there's fire. These guys are in cahoots. He was waving the communist shirt, so to speak. He was also trying to ride the political momentum the same way Richard Nixon had rode it. He was a freshman senator and had really not accomplished much. He saw that Richard Nixon was a freshman congressman from California in 1946, and he immediately became a hardliner on communism. He rode that to re-election in the House in 1948, and he rode his position as a communist hardliner to election to the Senate, had to represent the senator from California in 1950, and he furthermore rode that success to being tapped to be the vice presidential nominee in 1952. He wanted the same success of Richard Nixon, so he was following the two very logical, the two well-known political realities. These are the political reality of being a communist hardliner and disparaging the other political party for being a party of treason. Now his accusations had him boasting of having a great list of thousands of subversive communists in the United States. But historians, observers, and even the contemporaries view that as a lie. Has he never produced a single name off of the list, and after his death, no such list was ever found. Now, as happens in politics, McCarthy was challenged by a political rival, Senator Millard Tydings from Maryland, another Dixiecrat. MacArthur countered by Tydings' accusation by naming Tydings a communist and calling for him to be investigated. Now, this became McCarthy's response to challengers. The allegations of being affiliated with communism in the 1950s was a very dangerous one. It is much like the accusations. The accusation itself was enough to alter social perceptions of the person. Whether the person was guilty or innocent, it was enough to alter their perceptions and ruin their public reputations, their public personas. It didn't matter if after the accusation a person were proven innocent, their reputation, their personal means to procure a livelihood would be ruined. The person would be literally their life would just be shattered. It's like it's much like a false rape accusation. It really doesn't matter if it comes out or not. The accusation itself will stand to reason in the minds of some to that person's guilt, even if innocence had been proven, or even in the financial sector, the tint of working for a Ponzi scheme or for a scheme, a business that did business the wrong way, that scammed investors, that did not pay dividends. You'll be tainted by association. Is where I'm getting what I'm getting at and what I'm trying to convey. You will simply be tainted by association. McCarthy rode this understanding, and he knew that the accusations alone would be a death knell to his opponents. He was a populist of the worst order. He used rhetoric that associated himself with the middle class while admonishing his opponents for being members of a decadent elite class with no morals. The Hiss affair that implicated the Secretary of State was a very popular talking point of his, along with the notion of 20 years of treason. And that 20 years accounts for the Democratic hold on the presidency from Roosevelt's first term in 1932 until Eisenhower won the election of 1952. George Marshall, the man behind the Marshall Plan and a great national hero, a great national military man himself, was not immune from McCarthy. Had McCarthy eviscerated George Marshall with an accusation of treason that was primarily motivated by greed. So you have the man who came up with the economic plan to combat communism now falling prey to McCarthy. And McCarthy, his entire reign, the entire ideology of just recklessly accusing people and just recklessly behaving in politics itself became known and is still known as McCarthyism. Now, the novel Catch-22, written by Joseph Heller, was released in this social atmosphere, the social and political atmosphere. Now, Catch-22 is set during World War II, but perfectly captured the Korean War / McCarthyism era. McCarthy became known to his Senate contemporaries for his theatrics. He would make these grandiose displays and then shift ground to keep his adversaries off ground, to keep them from being able to pinpoint him and disprove him. When his allegations became illogical, he again shifted ground. From the Republican Party's point of view, it was tempting to just leave McCarthy alone, to just let him be. They had been in the political badlands for such a long time. They wanted the return to the 1920s prestige that the party had. So they could, on the one hand, deplore McCarthy's actions, and on the other hand, they could see a very useful use. They could see a very profitable use to his message. And again, his message struck a very powerful chord with voters. This led Republicans to simply overlook his actions, and Democrats to learn to tread carefully, as any opposition on their part would make them targets of McCarthy's accusations. Now, McCarthy had legitimate followers and defenders, and they admitted that he had his faults and behaved in an uncouth manner, but was right on the major issues. In 1953, a book about McCarthy and his enemies was published. It was written by William F. Buckley and Brent Bozell, two of the future neoconservatives of the era, of their time, two rising neoconservatives. Now, McCarthy was not motivated by conviction, as I said earlier. This was all convenience for him. It was simply politically convenient to make these accusations. And in an amazing twist, he proved willing to fraternize with individuals whom he had regularly and very publicly accused of being communist agents. And ironically, he was genuinely surprised, Joseph McCarthy was genuinely surprised to discover that the men he accused of being communists and communist sympathizers wanted nothing to do with him. He was surprised and he was shocked. McCarthy did. He overdid himself. He confirmed his own downfall when he began attacking the United States Army itself. Even with the attack on the Army, though, Dwight Eisenhower was reluctant to get involved in this affair. He called it getting into the gutter. But if Eisenhower had done something sooner, his standing with the public, which was greater than McCarthy's, would have been able to stop McCarthy. In 1954, when the McCarthy Army hearings were being held, American social life had undergone a dramatic revolution. Just like how the radio had revolutionized society, so had the television. When the hearings were taking place, a large number of Americans had televisions, and they now had the ability to watch the hearings. It was a spectacle, to say the least. Many of his supporters, many of his civilian supporters, witnessed firsthand his high-handedness, and it turned them off. They saw how recklessly Joseph McCarthy threw out accusations and how he badgered his subjects rather than directly questioning them. The end of the Korean War, the public viewing of his tactics at work, and the distancing of Eisenhower from McCarthy and McCarthyism created the perfect storm that undid McCarthy. In his bid to discredit the Army, he was discredited, and the Senate passed a motion to censure McCarthy shortly thereafter. After his censure, his health gave out, and he died rather swiftly in 1957. The great fear he generated highlights the fragility of American society during the Cold War. And with that, we shall break. And As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. The Korean War, McCarthyism, they're all interesting draw points to the Cold War era. So I'll be very interested to hear your comments from information gained in this lecture, or just information you had, previous background knowledge you had coming in to this lecture. And I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.